Two men walk into the same stretch of desert. Same heat, same cracked earth, same brutal sun pressing down on everything without mercy. Neither one has water, neither one has tools, neither one has any technology beyond what they are wearing. The first man starts walking, scanning the horizon for civilization, covering ground, burning through his body's remaining moisture reserves with every mile. He finds nothing. By the end of the second day, he is in serious physical dangers. The second man stops almost immediately. He looks down instead of forward. He crouches next to a specific plant growing from a crack in the dry ground, studies it for a moment, then walks 30 feet to the left and crouches next to another. He digs, not randomly, not hopefully, with the quiet confidence of someone following directions. 4 feet down, the soil is damp. 6 feet down, his hands hit mud. 8 feet down, water begins seeping into the hole. Clean, drinkable groundwater, in what looked from the surface like completely dry, lifeless terrain. The second man was not lucky. He was not guessing. He was reading. The landscape was giving him precise, reliable, biological directions to underground water the entire time. And the plants he stopped to look at were not random. They were specific species, each one a living indicator of subsurface moisture conditions, each one growing exactly where it grows because water is exactly where it is. Beneath the surface, feeding roots that reach far deeper than the cracked, dry crust above suggests is possible. This skill has a name, phytohydrology, the reading of plant communities to locate underground water, and it is not fringe wilderness theory. It is a documented science with applications in professional hydrology, archaeological research, and military survival training. It is also one of the oldest navigation skills in human history, practiced by desert-dwelling cultures on every arid continent for thousands of years, before drilling technology, before modern well equipment, before any of the infrastructure that makes water feel like something that comes from a tap, rather than something that requires understanding to find. Here is what is happening biologically. And once you understand the mechanism, the skill stops seeming like intuition and starts seeming like reading a map someone left in the ground. Plants cannot move. This fact, which seems obvious, has a profound implication that most people never fully think through. A plant that requires consistent moisture to survive cannot walk to a water source. It can only grow where water already is, or where its roots can reach water that exists at depth. When you see a specific moisture-dependent plant growing in an otherwise dry landscape, it is not there by coincidence. It is there because its root system found water at a depth that the surface gives no indication of. The plant is the visible surface expression of an invisible underground water condition. It is a flag planted by biology in the exact location where water exists. You do not need equipment to read this map. You need knowledge of which plants are flying which flags. The 5 plants you need to know are not rare. They are not difficult to identify. Some of them you will recognize immediately the moment you see them because you have been walking past them your entire life in the wrong context, seeing them as background vegetation rather than as information. The first is cottonwood. If you are in North America and you see cottonwood trees at any distance, there is water. Not probably. Not maybe. There is water. Cottonwoods have one of the highest water requirements of any tree in arid and semi-arid North American landscapes, and they simply cannot grow to maturity without consistent access to a water table or a subsurface water source. Their roots track water horizontally and vertically with extraordinary efficiency. When indigenous peoples of the American Southwest needed water in unfamiliar territory, they looked for cottonwood on the horizon before they looked for anything else. The tree was a landmark, not a scenic one, a directional one. In open desert terrain, a stand of cottonwood visible from a distance is telling you with more certainty than most instruments that if you dig in that location, you will find water within 10 to 20 feet of the surface, and in many cases, significantly less. The second plant is cattail. Cattails do not merely indicate nearby water, they indicate water at or very near the surface. The presence of cattails in any landscape means the water table is high enough that it essentially touches the root zone, which for cattails means it is within a foot or 2 of the ground surface. If you find cattails, you do not need to dig deeply. You may only need to dig at all in the sense of pushing through soft, wet soil to reach standing water just below a dry surface crust. Cattails grow at the edges of marshes, along slow streams, around the perimeters of seasonal ponds, and in low-lying areas where subsurface moisture concentrates. In a survival context, finding cattails is not just finding a water indicator. It is finding water itself, nearly always within arm's reach of the surface. The third is willow. Willows are among the most water-faithful plants in temperate and semi-arid landscapes. They evolved specifically as riparian species, meaning they grow along watercourses and in locations with consistent subsurface moisture. A willow growing in otherwise dry terrain is not surviving on atmospheric moisture or infrequent rainfall alone. Its root system is accessing something below the surface. The characteristic that makes willows particularly useful as water indicators is their tendency to grow in lines following underground watercourses that may not have any visible surface expression at all. A line of willows crossing an otherwise uniform dry hillside is frequently marking an underground stream or a water-bearing geological layer that runs beneath the surface in exactly the direction the trees are growing. Follow the line, the water is under it. The fourth indicator plant is elderberry. Elderberry prefers moist, well-drained soil and appears reliably in locations where subsurface moisture is present but not so high that the ground becomes saturated. It tends to mark the transitional zone between very wet and dry conditions, which in practical terms means it often grows at the edges of underground water sources where the soil moisture radiates outward from the main water-bearing layer. In landscapes where cottonwood and willow are absent due to elevation or regional plant communities, elderberry becomes a primary water indicator. Desert survival instructors in the American Southwest consistently list elderberry as one of the 5 most reliable plant-based water signs in their operational environments. The fifth is arrowweed, or in other regional landscapes its functional equivalent, which is any tall, dense reed or grass species growing in isolated clusters in dry terrain. Arrowweed in the Sonoran and Mojave deserts is one of the most reliable water markers known to desert survival practitioners. Its root system is adapted specifically to reach deep water tables in sandy desert soils, and it grows in the dense, healthy clusters that distinguish it from drought-stressed vegetation precisely because it is not drought-stressed. It has water. When everything around it is sparse, yellowed, and low to the ground, and arrowweed is standing 4 to 6 feet tall and densely green, it is not doing that on atmosphere alone. Dig near it. Dig in the direction where the densest growth is concentrated. The water is there. Now here is the part that should genuinely trouble you if you think about what it means. This knowledge was not academic in its original context. It was survival infrastructure. The desert-dwelling cultures of the American Southwest, the Aboriginal peoples of the Australian interior, the Tuareg and Berber peoples of the Sahara, the Sand people of the Kalahari, every culture that built sustainable life in arid environments, did so in large part because they could read the landscape for water the way you read a street sign for directions. This was taught to children. It was passed through generations with the same deliberate seriousness as any skill that the community's survival depended on, because that is exactly what it was. Not a hobby, not optional knowledge, a core human competency that kept people alive in conditions where the wrong decision about where to find water meant death within days. And then the infrastructure came. Pipes, pumps, municipal water systems, bottled water on every corner, taps in every structure. And the knowledge that preceded all of that infrastructure, the knowledge that made human habitation of harsh environments possible for 10,000 years before a single pipe was laid, was allowed to fade from common transmission. Not suppressed exactly, just deprioritized, quietly moved from essential to irrelevant by the arrival of systems that made it seem unnecessary. The problem with that trade is not the infrastructure. The infrastructure is genuinely valuable. The problem is what happens when the infrastructure fails. Drought, disaster, infrastructure collapse, displacement, any scenario where the tap stops working. In that moment, the person who retained the old knowledge and the person who never learned it are not in the same situation. They are in completely different survival realities. Here is what most people get wrong when they try to apply plant-based water reading, and the mistakes matter because acting on a misread in a real survival situation has serious consequences. The most critical mistake is confusing drought-stressed vegetation with water indicator vegetation. A plant that is simply surviving on minimal rainfall looks superficially similar from a distance to a water indicator plant. The distinguishing characteristic is relative health compared to surrounding vegetation. A water indicator plant in dry terrain should look noticeably healthier, greener, and more vigorous than the vegetation around it. If everything in the area looks equally stressed, you are reading general drought conditions, not a localized water source. The second mistake is treating any single plant sighting as definitive. The most reliable water readings come from clusters and combinations. Cottonwood and willow growing in proximity, cattails alongside dense green grasses. Multiple indicator species occurring together in the same location dramatically increases the confidence level of the reading. A single specimen could be an anomaly. Multiple species together is a convergent signal that the underground conditions are genuinely water-bearing. The third mistake is digging without reading direction. Underground water moves. It follows geological gradients, moves through specific soil layers, and concentrates in specific microtopographic low points. If you identify a water indicator plant community, look at the topography before you dig. Water will be most accessible at the lowest point of the indicator zone, where it would naturally pool in the subsurface layer. Digging at the highest point of an indicator cluster is the least productive location. Dig low, dig where the densest growth concentrates. The historical record of this skill operating at civilization building scale is more impressive than most people realize. The ancient Nabatean civilization, which built the city of Petra in what is now Jordan, one of the most water-scarce environments in the Middle East, developed such sophisticated plant-based and landscape-reading water location skills that they were able to supply a city of tens of thousands of people in near-desert conditions through a combination of engineered cisterns and a deep understanding of where subsurface water could be accessed. Nabatean water engineers did not have drilling equipment or geological surveys. They had accumulated observational knowledge of plant communities, soil types, and topographic indicators refined over generations of necessity. The water system they built supplied Petra reliably for centuries. The Aboriginal Australians of the Western Desert developed what anthropologists describe as one of the most sophisticated landscape reading knowledge systems ever documented, including the ability to locate water in terrain that visiting European explorers, equipped with tools and supplies, repeatedly found lethally dry. The difference was not the terrain was identical. The difference was knowledge. Specifically, the knowledge of which plants were telling the truth about what was underneath them. We have built a world where that knowledge feels optional because the infrastructure usually works, but the infrastructure is not the knowledge. It is the product of knowledge applied at scale. And when the product becomes unavailable, the knowledge is what determines who survives the gap. There is something deeply worth sitting with in the image of those two men in the desert, both in the same place, both facing the same apparent impossibility, one of them operating with information and one of them operating without it.